Major funding for these programs is provided by the CUNY TV Foundation, Capital One Bank, Geneva Burns, Tomasi and Webster, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Perfect Building Maintenance, the Wickoff Group, New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Greenberg Traurig, LLP. Additional funding is provided by AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, Colliers International New York City, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG Partners, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Eastern Union Funding, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Herrick Feinstein LLP, Hersha Hospitality Trust, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides Centurion Holdings, Margolin Weiner and Evans LLP, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, New Banks, People's United Bank, Popular Community Bank, RBS Citizens Bank, SJB Properties, Sterling & Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, Urban American, and These Friends.
Southerner, a Southern lawyer who worked in the Solicitor General's office, who's a venture capitalist, who happens to be one of the leading individuals in Jewish philanthropy. I'm fortunate to have Richard Stone, or Professor Richard Stone, here today. So tell me a little bit about your parents and your grandparents, because, you know, we wonder how people migrated to Alabama. And then Louisiana, okay? And you have interesting stories about that. Tell me about family.
First, Michael, I'm very glad to be with you, have this chance to talk to you. All four of my grandparents came close to the beginning of the century. They were all what's called Lithuanian-style Jews.
Would we call them Litvaks?
Litvaks. They were all Litvaks. Two of them came with knowing each other, and the other two married, having arrived here not knowing each other. And they ended up with different stories in Louisiana.
So tell me the stories, because you told me that your grandfather
my grandfather
had to leave because of the pogrom, and he killed somebody.
My grandfather on my mother's side, who came from a extremely religious and scholarly family, though he himself was not so scholarly, found himself in their little town, which was called Greive, which was outside Bialystok. And he was in a pogrom, found himself in a store, Jewish store, and a Jewish girl was being raped. And he picked up a heavy object and hit a Cossack over the head and killed him. And he fled, prudently I think, to Leipzig, Germany, where he apprenticed himself to a non-Jewish tailor for a year or two. I never learned too much about time in Leipzig, and then he accumulated whatever he needed to come over in steerage. I did hear many times the story of how sick he was on the entire trip, and he arrived in New York and did what so many did and worked as a tailor in a sweatshop. And that wasn't for him. He was a very independent, hardy, great-looking, athletic guy.
So how does he end up in Louisiana?
He started peddling, and he headed south because it was more open space and seemed to be what he wanted, though I doubt he'd seen too much open space around Bialystok either. But he ended up in, not just in the south, he ended up in a little town. Didn't take him long to get there, on the Louisiana-Mississippi border called Bogalusa, Louisiana, that was famous in the mid-60s as a hotbed of civil rights dissension. And
KKK.
It was a KKK, a Ku Klux Klan.
So that's your mother's side,
That's
right?
my mother's side. My father's side, I don't know as much about the story, but they ended up in New Orleans, they were also fleeing economic.
Were
They were fleeing
wa-
economic hardship.
Was he a peddler also? Or?
No, he wasn't a peddler. They got to New Orleans, and he had a variety of things to make a living. They were poor by comparison. My mother's family in the country became affluent
They were
fairly early. They became merchants and landowners, and we still have land in that part of the world. But my father's family, I think they lived over a store for a while. There's some small store that they operated. And my grandfather was getting into the construction business when at age 48 at a family picnic he dropped dead, which was one of those seminal moments in family history, and you see the repercussions of it 90 years later. My father was the only one of his siblings who went to high school, and he was 18, and his father dropped dead and left him with a poor mother and 2 sisters.
Now he went to college, but he also went to law school.
Went to law school and he made a partnership in law school. He and a very aristocratic Episcopalian gentleman were the top 2 students in the class, became lifelong best friends, and founded a law firm, practiced alone for a while, as people did back then, and began to build a law firm that became, I think it's no insult to any other law firm in New Orleans to say that they have been perhaps the preeminent law firm in New Orleans. His partner became an immensely important federal judge who was named was a Supreme Court possibility and viewed in scholarly circles as one of the great judges of the 20th century. His name was John Minor Wisdom, great name for a federal judge.
Now, your mother went to school also. Your mother, who's 98?
My mother is 98, and she is still totally alert and active in the Jewish community in New Orleans, as she has been as long as I've been alive. My mother graduated as the top student in her high school in Bogalusa, Louisiana at 15, and 2 weeks after she turned 16, she went to Duke. She went from Bogalusa to Duke. How she heard about Duke, I really don't know. This was 1931, and she went to Duke, and then she went to graduate school in social work, and she worked in Breathitt County, Kentucky for a while, which was quite an adventure. Breathitt County, Kentucky was a very impoverished, rough place. She said she saw things there that she can barely bear to remember. And then came back to New Orleans, and she and my father met, and they got married. And so she raised us in New Orleans, and she was very active in charity work.
So tell me about your life growing up in New Orleans. I mean, your dad was a prominent attorney, your mother an educated, self-sufficient individual heavily involved with the community. And tell me about your growing up, because originally you went to public school.
No, I never went to I have actually never gotten a free education other than a year that I spent without having any tuition many years later in an Israeli yeshiva. The first 12 years, kindergarten through the 12th grade, I spent in an excellent private high school.
But which had some Jewish roots.
Which had Jewish roots. It had originally been the manual training school. A German Jewish philanthropist established it as the manual training school for what was then a Jewish orphanage. There was a lot of turbulence, and there were Jewish orphans coming from Europe and so on. And it attracted a good liberal arts curriculum and faculty, so that both richer non-Jews and richer Jews began sending their children there. Eventually the orphanage disappeared, and it became, I think, academically the leading private school in New Orleans, and a position it's held. Interestingly, it was a small, highly academic private school with an athletic program that, as I used to say, people a little bit better than me, and that's not much, played on the football team, but Eli and Peyton Manning went there. So we're the only, I believe, the only high school in America to have produced 2 #1 draft picks. It's a trick question because they were brothers, but we produced 2 #1 draft picks.
Right, plus they weren't Jewish.
And they were not Jewish, absolutely not.
Right. Well, how did you decide that you wanted to become a lawyer and that you wanted to go to Harvard?
I'm not sure I ever decided I wanted to become a lawyer. I think that
you were told that you would
my brothers and I, it isn't even that we were told, it was just the obvious model. We had a very bright and strong-willed father whom we looked up to, and obviously that those things become more complex as you get older. But my older brother always knew he wanted to go to Harvard. He's deceased now. He was a fabulous person, great scholar, a character, an actor, very talented person. And he was sort of born knowing he wanted to go to Harvard, and the other two brothers followed suit. Luckily, we were able to go there.
You also wanted to get some more religious training.
Yeah, I was, even though we did not have a rich academic Jewish environment around us, there wasn't any great Jewish learning in New Orleans. There was, in our family and around New Orleans, there were pockets of deep regard for, respect for, and a sense of tradition for Jewish learning and for Jewish observance. My brothers and I all felt affected by that, oddly enough, particularly in Bogalusa, where the family was just seemed to have such a attachment, this tiny Jewish community there, to its European Jewish roots. But I was always interested in pursuing it further. So I requested that I have a private Hebrew teacher when I was in high school, and I acquainted myself through the years with some Hebrew and some ritual, and I became more interested. And then when I went to Harvard, it was I spent about half of my time at Harvard making up for the lack of a strong Jewish education. I was the private student of an outstanding Jewish scholar named Isidore Twersky, who was the son-in-law of the great Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. My grandmother's first cousin, by unbelievably random chance, was the great Harry Ostrin Wolfson, who was probably known in the middle of the 20th century as the greatest Judaica scholar in America, and maybe the greatest scholar at Harvard in his time. Had nothing to do with my going to Harvard, but his availability to me and his foisting me upon his student, Isidore Twersky, was a great break that I had. So then when I finished Harvard College and on my way to Harvard Law School, I took time off and studied in an Israeli yeshiva and sharpened up my skills a little bit and tried to make up for an education that I hadn't gotten.
Then you go back to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
During law school, you worked for a law firm.
I worked during the summer, but
Right.
I couldn't do much of that because the way, I don't know how it works now, but if you were one of the people lucky enough to make the Harvard
were in law review.
If you were lucky enough to make the law review from the end of your first year, you had a very short summer and they brought you back.
So you graduate Harvard Law, and what do you do next?
I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to live in New York, but I also felt conflicted about not moving back to New Orleans and joining my father and my brother, who, as I say, were in an outstanding law firm, and I felt some sense of family pull to be there. But I really wanted to go to New York for my own purposes, including the fact that I wanted to be part of a bigger national Jewish community and more of a Jewish academic environment. So I did the logical thing. If you're conflicted between New Orleans and New York, I moved to Washington. I moved to Washington. And I spent a couple of years in a big law firm in Washington. Big law firm life was really not suited to me, and I not suited to it. And I was looking around for something else to do. I almost left to join the Rockefeller campaign in 1968. That I was in Washington during the unbelievable year of 1968, that you're a little young to remember it as vividly as I do, but it was one of the most astonishing years to be alive in American history.
So how do you end up in the Solicitor General's office?
As I had a mentor at Harvard Law School who later became my colleague in the Justice Department, a remarkable intellect named Ernest Brown, who was also from Louisiana. And he found it too difficult to weather the student uprisings, and so he left academia and went to the Justice Department. He was a tax lawyer, tax professor, and he left to become just a staff lawyer in the Justice Department. He became probably the greatest ever. And he said to me one day, I know you're not, so he called me and said, I know you're not so happy at practicing law. He said, Erwin Griswold, who had been the dean of the Harvard Law School for 25 years, prior to his becoming Solicitor General, when Thurgood Marshall was appointed to the Supreme Court in '67, Griswold was made Solicitor General. This was in the Nixon administration.
Which was very interesting for you. right? You had a couple of interesting cases.
The Solicitor General's office was an experience after which no
I mean, you
experience as
pled.
a lawyer is
I mean,
the
you
same.
pled in front of the Supreme Court.
I was maybe 2 weeks short of my 27th birthday the first time I put on a morning coat and striped pants and represented the United States government in a Supreme Court argument. Not a mind-blowingly important argument, small point, but it was an argument in the Supreme Court. I argued before Hugo Black and William Douglas and John Harlan. It was a very, very interesting time. And I argued a dozen cases over the 4 years that I spent there. Some of them got to be much bigger cases.
So you're there 4 years, and then what happens? You could have gone back to New Orleans, or you could have stayed in Washington, but there were a couple of things that happened, right?
Yeah. I really, at that point, I had, I guess, grown up enough to realize I wanted to go to New York, so I should go to New York. But I wanted first to take another year. I was still single. I wanted another year in Israel. And I wanted to kind of cement my textual skills and get to a slightly higher level. So I studied Talmud that year in a Israeli school, a little different from the kind that I had studied in earlier. And I had one of the most remarkable experiences that I think colored my public service career, which was that I was asked in September of that year to go to Russia, to go to the Soviet Union, and visit. This was really the height of the Cold War, obviously, 1973. Very different place. I've been many times to Russia since then. To visit Jewish communities in some obscure places that had never been visited before by people like me, to encourage them and give them material and information, encourage them to fight the war and try to emigrate. And my traveling companion in that trip was, by chance, Joseph Telushkin, who's a very well-known Jewish writer. I'm sure many of your listeners know who he is. He and I developed a lifelong friendship, spending a month in the Soviet Union. We went through the Sino-Soviet border, a city called Khabarovsk, that's now much better known than it is much better known now than it was then. And then we went through Siberia and visited the Jewish communities in Irkutsk and Novosibirsk, which was remarkable. The Yom Kippur War broke out.
Right, you had mentioned when this happened.
Right,
but
right.
This would probably be the onset, because what you've done over your career, which we'll get to, which I'll really call the crowning point, becoming the chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, started really from this visit 40-plus years ago.
Well, in a sense it did. I had been very involved in Washington, my time in Washington. I'm not sure legally because I was working for the federal government, but I think the statute of limitations has passed. I was very involved in getting the Soviet Jewry issue on the national agenda for both parties, neutral between the Republicans and
So how do you end up at Columbia Law School?
Right. So I
finished the year, the extra year.
I finished the year, and I was, my Jewish activism was definitely inspired by having made this incredible trip, and I was all ready to go to New York. And I decided that I wanted to try academia. I don't think I ended up really being an academic, but I wanted to teach, and I wanted to use academia as a base for various activities, and I was intellectually much more interested in that than I was in practicing law.
So you've been...
So I had been, the Solicitor General's office is not a bad platform from which to apply. I had a lot of help from my great relationship with Erwin Griswold, who was a fantastic person. I worked, by the way, a year with Bob Bork at the end. He was Solicitor General the last year that I was there, and that was also his not being confirmed to the Supreme Court, I view to this day as a serious error and even tragedy for many people. But I wanted to teach, and I was being interviewed around the country and looking for the right spot. I knew in my heart I wanted to come to New York, and if I wanted to come to New York, then
So
all
what's
respect to any other law school, I
what's
wanted
happened
Columbia.
over the next 40 years is a combination of, let's say, three diverse things, okay? Professor of law school at Columbia, heavily involved in the community and Jewish affairs, which we'll talk about with JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council, the IPA, you know, and venture capital. So how does the lawyer from Louisiana, who is the Talmudic scholar and venture capital, especially in biotech, tie up? Talk to me about that.
I don't think it has to tie up.
No, I didn't say tie it up.
I don't
but
think it does.
how do you enter?
I think
how do you get
people
involved
have
with venture
people have
capital?
various strands that interest them, and certainly both Jewish learning, Talmudic learning, and Jewish life.
I realize
Jewish activism.
Maimonides
Right.
was a physician, okay?
Right.
So you know, if we take the Maimonides
Yes.
situation, but you've been involved with a
And indeed,
number.
the role model over many centuries among great Jewish scholars was also to be able to be proficient in other things. I'm not making my comparison to myself in any of those ways.
But you've been involved with a number of biotech.
I always,
companies
my
over the years.
first job in New Orleans, the first job I ever had that paid, and it paid me, I worked 40 hours a week and made the minimum wage, which was $1.01 an hour. It was performing ministerial chores for stockbrokers at the Merrill Lynch office in New Orleans. And I think that the stock market got into my bloodstream back then. And I think venture capital was an offshoot of just enjoying watching and playing with securities, stock market prices, and so on from then.
But you've been involved with a number of biotech companies.
Yeah, I have, starting as an investor and then putting together a little group of angel investors and having a little more clout investing, and ultimately getting so deeply into it that I found partners who had shared my interests and who had experience in the non-financial aspects of it, who were scientists and bankers who made licensing deals and so on. And I became a founder of a few biotech companies. And that, aside from being exciting from a financial point of view, it really was exciting to have a few situations in which you started a company, licensed a technology, and when you're lucky and the technology gets to the market and actually does significant good for a disadvantaged and diseased population,
Makes you feel great.
You really can feel great.
So let's talk a little bit about the years. You know, you were involved with the OU, the Jewish community relationship,
Yeah.
and then really, you know, the Soviet Jewry.
Yeah, I had various strands of interest. I was very committed to Jewish life and to trying to make a contribution. It was too late for me to make a serious contribution as a scholar. That was my personal satisfaction, to be at least an educated Jew to some extent. But I thought maybe I could make a contribution to Jewish life in various ways. In the beginning, honestly, I thought, and this was 40 years ago, still much more proximity to the ruins of World War II, to the horror of World War II, when it appeared as though certain aspects of Jewish culture were really going to disappear. And I thought that the single most important thing was to play a role in preserving and rebuilding Jewish learning at the highest level. So one of the things in my earliest years, before I got more involved in community activism, was to assist in various ways schools of higher Jewish learning. And to this day, though I've been involved in a lot of other things besides, I am actually, part of my time is spent and resources is spent as the president of a very successful and interesting little yeshiva in Brooklyn that I think I am the first chairman of the President's Conference who was ever at the same time.
Chaim Berlin?
No, it's not Chaim Berlin, although I was the guest of honor at the Chaim Berlin dinner, and I'm close to the Chaim. It's a great yeshiva. This is called Beth Joseph. It's the descendant of the old Navardic yeshiva, about which the author Chaim Grada writes some amazing novels.
Let's talk a little bit about the conference.
I then began to branch out and become active. It occurred to me, not as a revelation, but that I really needed to spend more of my time, and my talent was probably better suited to trying to work with Jewish security, and that basically means Israel's the center of the Jewish world, I think, and Jewish security really means the preservation and strengthening of the state of Israel. I think the Israel-America relationship is incredibly important to Jews everywhere and to America. There are 51 organizations currently part of the conference. It runs the spectrum, the religious spectrum, the political spectrum, right to left, all the religious streams, the big defense organizations are all in this umbrella. It was formed in the 50s at the suggestion of John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, who I think was tired of having to talk to so many heads of Jewish organizations, even though there were very few at the time compared to what there is now, and suggested that there be one unified voice. So they started an informal council of presidents that evolved into the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. And I think that the chairmanship of that organization is maybe the most interesting. Mort Zuckerman is, in my opinion, one of the absolute greatest.
Ron Lauder.
The organization that I became chairman from, NCSJ, I'm the third chairman. Morris Abram, who was a great man. Shoshana Cardin also. Jim Tisch came from the Federation system. And Ron Lauder was the chairman. He's now the chairman of the World Jewish Congress.
With 1 minute left, we have to talk about the children. Tell me about the children.
Okay, I have 4 wonderful children, 3 girls, and then a little boy was born.
Okay, names.
Late in my life, Rebecca, who is married and has 1 child and, God willing, 1 on the way. Rebecca is married to an entrepreneur named Seth Berkowitz, who people may know. A little group of stores called Insomnia Cookies, of which there are 40 around the company. That's a business that he started
And they have,
college
they have
out of his dorm room.
They have 1 child?
They have 1 child and 1 on the way.
What's the name of the?
Simon. And then I have, my second daughter is Alana. Rebecca went to Harvard. Alana went to Columbia and traded options at UBS and has done a lot of interesting things since then. She's knows a lot about sports and about poker and about a lot of things. She's a yoga expert. The next daughter, Eliza, who recently married a wonderful English boy. Eliza went to Harvard also, and she was my mother's 8th or 9th direct descendant to go to Harvard.
And your son?
She's a great artist.
And your last?
And my son is a fine Talmudist and a wonderful boy, and he goes to Yeshiva University, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's the only one that ends up in law school or business school or something like that.
So I think you've had a very interesting journey. I know that your mother will enjoy watching this, and so will the kids, and I'm really happy that you've been my guest today.
Thanks, Michael. It's a lot of fun, and you do a great show, and keep it up.
Thank you.